I feel like there is not enough conversation around how our cognition is changing every day. And it's changing because we are quick to offload as much of it as possible to some sort of a tool. And that's because our ability to offload our cognition has gotten much better over the years. And now we are at a phase where it's accelerating, and some of it is necessary because we have more data to process, more things to remember, but some of it is just convenience, which then also results in laziness, and that is not a good thing. So that's what this video is about. It's about looking at how cognitive offloading is rupturing our ability to think, remember, and reflect. It's about our ability to outsource some sort of decision making and creativity to an external form, a technology or a tool. Because right now we are at this point in time where we can see the very early signs of how Gen AI tools are impacting our cognition. But if you were to extrapolate the downsides of it, you could very easily get a glimpse of where we are headed. So we need to have those discussions today. But before we get to that part, I just want to rewind a little to show you that this gradual shift did not happen overnight. It came in waves, 3 distinct waves, and now we might be at the cusp of the 4th one. And just to be clear, here I'm not talking about these super early forms of cognitive offloading that humans discovered, things like cave paintings or scribbling your thoughts with feathers. I'm not talking about any of the analog or non-digital milestones, like pens and papers and typewriters. I'm specifically talking about the digital waves, especially the ones that started with us transitioning from a tangible writing process to more of a digitized virtual methods. The one that started with the digitization of everything, the one that started when we figured out how we can offload certain things like contact information, birthdays, extensive formats of tabular data that could be stored anywhere safely and then retrieved on demand. And one could argue that this sort of shift was not only useful, but also necessary. Yes, there was memory erosion in different ways because we did not have to do mental recall every now and then because most of the useful information was stored somewhere else anyway, but it helped us create space for other important things. So this sort of trade-off where we exchanged a little bit of cognition, mostly memory, in exchange for utility and convenience was actually a good thing. Yeah, sure, we could no longer brag to our family or friends how many phone numbers and other details we could remember, but those felt like less useful or nice to have skills anyway. But then came the second wave of connectivity, basically the internet and the web applications, early versions of web social media, access to various databases in a few clicks. So now the information access to all sorts became ambient, but at the same time, the value of not knowing something or not remembering something sort of plummeted. We could always just, always Google things. So the urge to read long form content or to understand a concept in depth, or even the ability to stay focused for a very long time on a single activity reduced quite a bit. We stopped forming deep internal mental models, and instead we started to lean more on some sort of hyperlinks or internet prescribed ways to deal with day-to-day things. I mean, one thing we all have experienced and still do experience on a large scale is how context switching impacts our ability to focus and retain information. I often see people with dozen tabs open on a single browser, and some people have multiple browsers with multiple tabs open in each of them, and then some people have multiple virtual desktops, each with multiple browsers in them, because that's how we evolved to navigate information and different contexts. So the processing of information became very shallow. The long-term retention and then deep comprehension sort of became optional and very selective, which was obvious because the scope and the breadth of how much knowledge we can grasp easily all of a sudden became really large. So it made sense that we prioritized where we maximize our understanding. But even that effort was sort of ruptured by information overload. And all of this was then further accelerated with the third wave of mobile and app ecosystems, because now we did not have to open the laptop to look for information. We got it right in our pockets on smartphones. So it reduced the friction of retrieving information drastically. It reduced the number of steps needed to gather information. And the more advanced the applications and their ecosystems got, the more intense the experience became. So the offloading was now of orders of magnitude. It was not just limited to memory and attention, but also of some basic skills that we had learned over the years through education and practice, or by paying deliberate attention. things like the ability to spell words correctly. So if I remember correctly, the memes around how Google sometimes doesn't even understand what we want to say originated more than a decade ago. And we laughed at it because it was poking fun at a very common experience. We all at some point had spelled a word and failed miserably at it because we had developed the reliance on a system that would auto-complete it for us. But then it got so bad that even the systems couldn't even ballpark our horribly wrong estimates. And I'm sure if we were to compare our ability to spell words from a decade ago to now, there's a good chance that most of us would say that it's declined. We struggle more now than we did before. And the same goes for our, spatial sense and awareness. I remember growing up, we could go to a neighborhood a few times and take a mental note of where we were and how things were because we had to rely on our cognition for the most part. But now, can you imagine navigating a new city or a new place without GPS? I mean, you could technically, but it won't be a fun exercise and it may feel like a lot of work. And another example is the intuitive sense to just run multi-step arithmetic to do simple math problems because you could just Google, what an 18% tip on a $76 bill would be. So the point is that whether we realize it or not, there are many ways in which our cognition has declined in the last 20 to 30 years. And one could argue that this rate or kind of decline was mostly, benign because it's probably a good thing to outsource most of these tasks to a machine anyway, because unless you enjoy them and practice them regularly, it feels like mental labor. So logically, if you automate those tasks, you could free up a lot of your mental processing and memory to focus on things that actually matter. And I think that's a valid argument because we gained a lot in the process. The base level of general knowledge and common knowledge itself got elevated globally. So that sort of exchange of a little bit of memory, a little bit of comprehension and context, and a lot of attention to gain extreme efficiencies was a decent deal for the most part until now. Because now we are entering or have entered the fourth wave, which is about artificial intelligence. And we are seeing the early versions of agentic AI. So now the trade-off surface itself has expanded and it will most likely expand even more, meaning we will trade our cognition at a far deeper and broader scale. And that is because it will intersect with our ability to not just remember, but also to retrieve, conceptualize, and represent information. So the base level for memory retention and information retrieval got elevated in the earlier waves. With this wave, the ability to conceptualize things, to synthesize and create new things, to form original ideas, to connect abstract thoughts and concepts and to generate meaning, to arrive at a complex decision by evaluating all the possible outcomes, to think critically, to reflect deeply. All of these things will get augmented and sort of get reshaped, which means we'll feel more advanced overall because we'll be able to do tasks at a much faster speed and at a more precise level. But if you were to strip away all those tools and the forms of assistance, you would feel very deficient in most of those areas. And that is because in a few years, and I don't have a timeline for it, but it feels like somewhere in the next 10, 15 years, we may have lost the intuitive ability to do most of those things on our own. We would have become heavily reliant on tools just to do about 90% of the tasks that we would do today with minimal to no assistance. So one way to visualize this is to think of a cognitive displacement matrix and some sort of a heat map to represent the impact of it. So here you can compare broader cognitive areas against the different technological waves and then score each component on a scale of impact. So here, if you see a light color, then that means the impact is less. And if you see the dark color, that means the impact is severe. So if you see something in light yellow, like decision making, then you can see that in the first wave of digitization, it was not impacted a lot because we still have the authority over end-to-end decision making. Then with the second and the third wave, it got a bit more darker because the apps started to nudge us in different directions. They started to manipulate our ability to think independently. They amplified our cognitive biases. But still, we had the ability to, cut through all that noise and sort of move ahead. But in this wave, in the fourth wave, what's most likely going to happen is that the systems could potentially take away our agency over certain decisions, which, may not be a bad thing overall if you are just purely looking at the outcomes, where a system knows your preferences and then decides to act on your behalf, saving you a lot of time. But then repeated reliance on it over a period of time may start to impact your ability to decide confidently. And then the same thing goes for other cognitive areas like critical thinking, ideation, and memory. And here in this diagram, there are a couple of caveats that it's a directional representation for the purpose of this video. It's not a research-backed data. So we can debate about the color of each block based on our, personal subjective experiences. But we may largely agree on one thing, that the cognitive erosion and the cognitive augmentation can both happen at the same time. Another caveat is that it's not an exhaustive taxonomy of all cognitive functions. There are so many other areas like imagination, moral reasoning, or even things like boredom tolerance that aren't captured here but could just be as vulnerable. The point is that we are on that trajectory as individuals and as a society to become way more efficient than we ever were. But the problem starts to become more evident when we move from enhancing cognition to then avoiding doing some sort of mental labor. And that's the point when our reliance on technology becomes really problematic, because we are seeing very early signs of it already. Ever since ChatGPT came out, there have been so many instances and reports where people seem to have completely outsourced their ability to critically think on a subject. So for example, the students that started college in the last 2 to 3 years may perform better overall, but their reliance on these technologies and tools is sort of undeniable. Nowadays, no one has a blank page problem anymore, where you just let your mind diverge in multiple directions and you come up with some sort of an original idea or a thought. You just log into the application of your choice, you get a nudge, and sometimes the full essay or the script or the answer that you're looking for. And once you have that answer, you also rely on it because your metacognition, which is the ability to doubt or question your own thinking, takes a hit because the response you get from the LLM tools sound really smart, even if it hallucinates. So it sounds really well packaged, and it reduces the need for you to cross-check it or modify it. And a great example of that is if you go on a platform like, let's say, LinkedIn, where most of the people post provoking thoughts and opinions in a much more civilized manner compared to some of the other social media platforms. You would see that about 50% of that content looks like it's just a copy and paste from some sort of an LLM app. And you can figure that out just from the format that they use. It's, perfectly aligned, coherent, bland text with just too many rocket and green check mark emojis in each sentence. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that if you think about it, but it does sort of show how the originality or the distinct voice has already taken a hit. And so as a result, most of the responses seem more polished and structured, but also most of the responses seem pretty average in originality and the message that they want to convey. And as a result of all of this, there also is a significant rise in one's ability to execute things or believe that they can execute things, which may sound like a good thing, because why not? Everyone should have that ability. It's good for their mental health and self-esteem. But the problem is that that sense of false confidence actually comes from something called cognitive bloating, where you have a lot of information, you consume them, but you haven't had the chance to chew on them, so you don't quite understand them. And there is no second level of thinking involved. So you believe everything to be true without understanding how the answers are extracted, which is just another form of cognitive offloading as well. So anyway, if we have these issues and if we know that they're going to get worse in some form in the coming years, then what can we do about them today? Do we solve them at the design level, where the applications guide you instead of giving you all the answers? Quite like the old Q&A guidebooks for exams, where you get the hint to reach the answers right below the questions, but if you wanted to directly reach the answers, you could just flip a couple of pages and look at it. Or should the applications be designed with some level of friction built in them for certain use cases, quite like the D&D mode in your phones to save you from distractions? Or should this happen at a cultural level, where we promote some sort of cognitive flexibility and cognitive health training like we do for physical health? Or should this be a policy change where government enforces some sort of a regulation where people have to put in some effort to understand things? And the answer is, we don't know yet. It's very early and it doesn't seem like a problem at the moment. So it's hard to come up with a solution for it. And also, the solution doesn't need to be one-dimensional. It could intersect with multiple things like design choices, cultural shifts, policy guidelines, and I would say even some form of spiritual reframing of the whole situation. So that's something we need to think about, and it's just a nudge in that direction. And before I end this video, I just want to say that if you look at the AI community discussions, at least when it comes to the skepticism side of it, it's mostly concentrated around privacy, job loss, policy, regulations, etc. And those are all valid and critical topics, obviously. But what if the real cost of convenience are not those things, but instead it's the slow and quiet erosion of our capacity to think, to wonder, to remember, to decide without a heavy reliance on an external party or a tool? Because that's not something you can outsource. And maybe that's exactly what the point is.